Welcome to the 15th Annual Visiting British Student Debate Program at Prince George's Community College. I'm Dr. Melinda Frederick, Professor of Political Science here at the college, and I have the pleasure of coordinating this year's event. This annual event is made possible through our collaboration with the National Communication Association's Committee for International Debate and Discussion and the English-Speaking Union, who each fall sponsors visiting British debaters, like the two here today, who will travel throughout the United States to debate at 2- and 4-year colleges and universities. The debaters are brought here to our college through the generous support from the Teaching, Learning, and Student Success area and the Honors Program, and are hosted by the Division of Humanities, English, and Social Sciences. I'd like now to introduce our guest debaters, Maeve Flanagan and Owen Mooney. Maeve has a master's in international security studies from the University of St. Andrews and a first-class honors undergraduate degree in history and English from University College Cork. Maeve is also qualified in conflict mediation, having worked on the Glen Cree Reconciliation Program in Northern Ireland. Maeve has a long history of competitive debating, including winning the Queen's University Belfast 4 in 2016 as speaker, and has also vast judging experience across Europe. Maeve is now moving toward a teaching role within debating and was a coach at the English-Speaking Union's International Public Speaking Competition last May, and again at the English-Speaking Union Debate Academy in August. Maeve has taught debating also to secondary school students throughout the ESU's Discover Your Voice program and is highly invested in empowering young people to reach opportunities through debating. Welcome, Maeve.
Thank you.
Owen Mooney. Owen is a recent graduate in economics and economic and social history from the University of Glasgow. Speaking for the Glasgow University Union, he has won the Scottish, British, and European universities debating competitions, as well as 15 other competitions across Europe. He's also been the chief adjudicator of competitions in the UK, Ireland, the UAE, and Pakistan. He's an experienced debating and public speaking coach, having coached political campaigners, school students from a variety of backgrounds, and the Glasgow University Union competitive debating squad for the past 2 years. Owen has also worked on British political campaigns, including the 2014 Scottish independence referendum. This is Owen's second trip to the USA, and he's looking forward to exploring more of the country and meeting fantastic people. Please welcome Maeve and Owen. At this time, I'd like to introduce Professor Ennis Allen, Chair of the Department of Humanities, who will facilitate the debate. Ennis?
Thank you, Melinda. You will see a debate in the Lincoln-Douglas format, allowing each person to present and defend his or her position. Please note that this is much different from the presidential and vice presidential debates that you have watched in the past. These debaters are going to stay on topic. Following the debate, we will ask you for a vote as to who made the best argument, and we'll ask you to do that by clapping. The proposition to be considered today is, this House believes the United States should retaliate against ongoing Russian interference in U.S. elections. This morning, the debaters have flipped a coin. Maeve will argue in favor of the proposition, and Owen will argue against. The rules of the debate are as follows. There are 3 parts to the debate. First, a proposition, which is 8 minutes in length. Second, cross-examination, which is 3 minutes. And then lastly, a summary of 4 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, we will be timing you. You may set your phones. We'll also hold up 2 minute and 1 minute remaining to let you know that your time is up. Maeve?
Yes.
It's time for you to come to the podium.
Excellent.
Good luck.
Thank you.
And may the best argument win.
or multiple arguments. Let me know if I can start. Perfect. Russia hacked the election in 2016. They're going to hack the midterms in 2018. They're going to hack the presidential campaign in 2020. Retaliation is the only way that we have left to prevent that happening. Opposition has a burden in this debate to show you what methods he's going to use to make sure that those elections aren't hacked, right? Because what happened in 2016 was far beyond the memes that he's going to characterize that the Russians used to hack the election. Mueller's investigation has showed that they systematically purged voter rolls, right, in key districts, especially to disenfranchise minorities who lean Democratic. They use voter rolls, right, and the voting machines systemically miscounted votes to make sure that that the campaign went towards Trump. They leaked emails from the DNC, right, and from John Podesta to make sure that Hillary's campaign looked far worse, right? And I think these efforts are going to continue and are far more serious than a lot of Americans or a lot of people globally actually realise the depth of the hacking that's continuing to happen. So what have we tried thus far, and why isn't it working, and why do we need to retaliate in the way that I'm going to propose in this motion? Well, look, we've tried diplomacy. We've been trying diplomacy with Russia for the last, since the end of the Cold War and even during it, right? And diplomacy isn't working. But crucially, diplomacy isn't working ever since Salisbury, where we had to withdraw all of our diplomats from Russia because they decided to poison someone on UK soil, which is our ally, right? So diplomacy is out the window and isn't something that can be used in this unless we want to betray Great Britain, which as the British team we'd say, please don't do that, right? The second thing that isn't going to work is sanctions. We've actually had sanctions on the Russian, the key Russian people for years now. It's called the Magnitsky Act, right? And what we tried to do was we tried to isolate the cronies and the tycoons that support Putin's campaign, right? And it's not working, right? Just like financially closing them off in the world isn't good enough. We actually need to retaliate specifically against their companies and try and shut them down and try and shut down their networks, right? We can't go to war with Russia because the last time we tried to go to war for democracy, it didn't work out very well, right? But we also can't attack their democracy. So you might look at the motion and think we should retaliate by hacking their election. But first of all, that's not going to work because it isn't a democratic system in Russia. It just appears to be, right? So hacking their election isn't going to work very well because they already hack it themselves. But second of all, because we believe that democracy is sacrosanct, right? And that we shouldn't attack someone else's democracy because that's what we're trying to defend on this motion. And we think that democracy is incredibly important. So what are we going to do instead? We're going to retaliate against those who were culpable, right? And we're Mueller has criminally indicted these people, right? And it's time that we actually took a firm stance because Russia refuses to cooperate with us and let us even investigate or interview the people who are responsible, right? And if they will not let us do that, then we have a right and we have a duty to retaliate against them. So what are we going to do? Those oligarchs that I told you that prop up Putin's regime, right? They all run their money through these corrupt companies, right? They're shell companies and actual companies in Russia. The banks are also corrupt, right? And this is Putin's inner circle who support him because they know that they can get rich off him being lenient, right? What we're going to do to those companies is we're going to turn the lights off. We're going to disrupt their supply chains. We're going to leak their emails in the way that they leaked emails about Hillary Clinton, right? We're going to make the investors scared to invest in these companies, right? Because they're no longer turning profits or they seem weak. We're going to hurt their profits in the way that mere sanctions couldn't. Because actually the US and Russia weren't very financially intertwined in the way that, let's say, US and China are. And that's probably a legacy of the Cold War. So sanctions didn't really work because we weren't investing in each other, but actually hurting the companies from the inside by disrupting their supply chains will. We're going to do this relatively slowly so that we have some plausible deniability. We can say, oh, these are technical glitches, or it's not us, right? Or it's just the lights and the electricity in Russia are really bad. And they are really bad because the country is really, really corrupt, and that's part of the problem. But I think that Putin will cop on fairly quickly what we're doing, right? And that's fine. We want him to. We just don't think that he's going to announce it to the world, right? Because Putin knows, if we just analyse him as an actor here for a second, he knows that the risk of a palace coup is really, really high. If the people around him suddenly start losing their wealth, if they suddenly start losing their profit, if it's no longer profitable for them to support him, there's nothing magical about Putin. The only reason he's stayed in power so long is that he's managed to enrich people around him and make it still profitable for them to support him, right? But the thing about doing this privately, or at least somewhat secretly, is or not announcing the policy, is that it gives us flexibility to scale it up or down, right? So we're doing this quite minimalistically at the moment to make sure that they don't hack the midterms. If they hack the midterms, we will scale this up as much as possible to protect the presidential election in 2020, and we think that that's justified. But look, what do I think the outcome of this policy is? What will Putin do in response? I think he'll stop. Right? I think he'll stop trying to interfere in our elections, right? Because, first of all, he won't tell the people of Russia that this is happening because he doesn't want to lose face domestically, right? And he doesn't want to have caved in, right? But when the sharks around him smell blood in the water, we think he'll back down because it's now too costly for him politically and economically to attack us, right? Because if Putin only cares about power, we are attacking his economic wealth, his own personal economic wealth. We're attacking his political wealth of the cronies around him. But we're also attacking his political stability insofar as the Russian populace are now frustrated that their communication lines aren't working or that their gas bill is going up, but they don't know why that's happening, but they're still frustrated with him because he's the one that's meant to be protecting him, right? Putin only interfered in the US elections for power. He wanted more influence in the United States. But if you trade off some amount of power in the United States, right, which isn't that much anymore because now that we know about the interference, anytime anyone tries to do something that would help Russia, we all get a little bit suspicious, right? But he interfered here for power. If we make it cost more power to him, if we make it more dangerous for him to do this, we think that it's very likely that he will stop. But look, what are the risks of this policy? Will it backfire? There's not going to be an interstate war between US and Russia. There wasn't even an interstate war between us when we were at war in the Cold War, right? Like, I think there is upper limits here, and what we need to do is establish a red line. Like, you cannot interfere in our elections, and we will make this costly for you. But we both know that we're a bit chicken, and we're not going to actually go to war because the costs of that are too high, right? They can't hurt us economically because we are a much stronger economy. They can't use any influence against us because they don't have any influence in the international sphere. They can't really hack our companies in the same way that we can hack theirs, because our cyber systems are so much stronger because we are the technological hub of the world, right? But also because we've got a head start, we've got the warning, we know that this policy is happening, and we've strengthened our security systems as a result. But more importantly, they will not retaliate because this makes the battles of the will public. And Putin cannot win this game, right? And he cannot be seen to lose. So the only winning move for Putin is not to play, to decide, I'm not going to interfere in the next lot of elections because now they've made it too costly. Look, the risks of not doing this policy are enormous. They will interfere in the midterms. They will interfere in the presidential debate. They'll interfere in other democracies because we've stepped back and let them do so. It will embolden him to do other things like he did in Crimea, where he just annexed territory because no one was standing up to him. Appeasing Hitler didn't work either, right? And just standing back and saying we can do nothing is not true. We can do something and we can punch him in the gut where it hurts, right? He might get mad at us. He might try and sanction us. He might try and hack us. But those are all mights. What we know is what's going to happen is that they are going to cripple US democracy, and we think that's something worth protecting. We think that's worth saving. It is a might on Owen's side of this, right, of all of the bad things that could happen because of this policy. Against it definitely. Against they will definitely do this, right? And I think that even if he can prove that they will retaliate against us in some way, I also think that the US has to stand sometimes and has to make things clear. And for those reasons, I think you should propose. Cool. Do you want to do the cross?
Yeah, I guess.
Cool.
So this is what we'll do. Thank you, Maeve.
You're welcome.
And we'll have Owen stand up,
Okay.
and you all can cross-examine at this point. Thank you.
Thank you.
Open strong.
Thank you.
Okay, just a couple of questions.
Sure.
Number one, what actually is this adding to sanctions? Like, how does leaking a few emails from Gazprom hurt their profits? Tito, I'll just give you all the questions. You can answer them in order.
Oh, no, I think that I respond as much as I want.
Okay,
Because
there
you
you
just give me 10
sorry,
questions
sorry.
otherwise. Okay. Adding to sanctions. Sanctions is basically like they can't trade with certain countries or like our allies or whatever it is. But if you are just trading internally in Russia, it doesn't matter whether you can't trade with Britain, right? Because you're just making your profits internally, right? But you can only make your profits if the lights are working, right? If you can email other people in other companies because your servers are working, right? Like the difference is that we are making these companies completely ineffective from the inside out. The rot starts on the inside. The difference with sanctions is that it was an external policy and how Russia related with the world. But you must remember that Russia is massive. Like, when you look at Russia on a map, we don't realise quite how big it is and quite how internal a lot of its economy is, right? Which means that we have to do this policy internal to the companies because external sanctions and how it faced the world weren't really effective. That's the difference.
Okay, why would you not just go for a military response? Like, what is the reason you can't do that?
Oh yeah, okay, because I mean, that's an incredibly silly question, right? Because I just don't want US soldiers to die. I just don't think that Russia is a very good country to try and invade. I mean, historically, people have tried to invade Russia before, right? If you think about World War II or before that, and it just doesn't work. As I was saying, because Russia is just so massive and they just have so much territory, right? But also, I think that democracy is worth defending, but like I said in my glib point about the Iraq War, sometimes it's not worth defending if the things that we're going to do are undemocratic, right? So like invading Iraq was probably a slightly undemocratic policy or led to worse outcomes. At the point where we're killing random Russians on the ground who did nothing to deserve this, right? Who didn't vote for Putin because their system is also undemocratic, and we're going to war and hurting their soldiers, I don't think that that's the exact best way to go about this. And I think that would also escalate this entire situation, whereas the whole point of my case and my policy was that we're going to do this quite quietly. We're going to let him back down without losing face. Obviously, if we go to war to him, he can't back down from that situation. I think that leads to worse outcomes for everyone. I'll take one more question.
Okay, finally, if you're denying that you're doing this, then how does anyone in Russia know what pressure they have to put on Putin to stop doing?
Oh, I mean, what I said was, I'm sorry if people aren't understand my accents. They will know immediately. I mean, it's very, very obvious because, like, we knew the FBI knew pretty quickly, right? And like the KGB or the ex-KGB or the Secret Service in Russia are pretty good, or they wouldn't have been able to hack us in the first place, right? It's just the ordinary Russians on the ground who have a lot of like their media under control and don't get to know about things in the same way that even we might get to know about things. Won't know about this, right? But the people in the inner circle will know, right? Because it's their companies that are being affected by this. Because the way that the Secret Service works is it doesn't just go to Putin, it also goes to the people around him and his cronies, because that's how oligarchies work in a sense, right? And all those people have bought off their own agents and have bribed them to make sure that they are in the loop as well, and to make sure that they're connected and have an ear to power. I think that's the cross is up. It's 3 minutes. Perfect. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so that is the end of part 1. Moving on to part 2, where we will have Owen stand to give his proposition against. 8 minutes.
For those of you in the audience, please clap. And for those of you watching at home on YouTube, remember to smash that like button, like, comment, and subscribe. A couple of points, first of all. I think the first thing here is the scale to which Russian hacking or Russian attempted interference has been successful, or has actually done very much, has been grossly overstated, and is essentially like, it's been a very useful tool for the Democrats to avoid looking at their own mistakes and their own internal failures, but ultimately isn't backed up by the evidence. There was only a very small number of voters affected who saw things like fake news ads online. Most of them were disproportionately young and people who tend not to vote anyway. Far more important, if we want to talk about interference, is either the fact that the Democrats just lost the votes of large numbers of working class people who hadn't seen their lives improve or who hadn't seen their wages rise throughout the Obama period, and the fact that Hillary was essentially running as Obama Mark II, or as an extension of the Obama campaign, was never likely to play with these people. If we want to talk about interference, all that interference is closer to home. It's the FBI's decision to reopen the investigation into Hillary right before polling day, when they knew fine well that they were going to find nothing at all, solely in order to help Trump. Like, it just seems premature, before Mueller's investigation has concluded, that we're going to retaliate against Russia, without knowing to what extent this was something that Putin wanted to do, or whether or not it was something that he was doing because Trump was paying him off, or because other members of the Republican Party were looking forward to doing this. I also just don't think this is going to be effective. Why? Because, like, look, it's not so much that we're closing the stable door after the horse is bolted. We're doing it after the horse is bolted, crossed the road, moved to a larger 2-story stable, grown old, had 2 kids, and finally keeled over and died. Everyone is going to be hacking US elections from now on. China, Iran, like literally private companies could do so if they have a reason. The core thing we need to focus on is how to better defend the US from this, rather than retaliating against one person who's done this in future. There's several things we need to do. We need to do things like conclude how we can vastly improve our cybersecurity by doing things like taking voter rolls off the internet and putting them onto closed circuit computers where you can't hack them until you physically get there. We need to repair faith in democratic institutions, which the loss of which was what ultimately made people vulnerable to the effects of things like fake news or whatever. Ultimately, an attack against Russia is only a distraction from this. Specifically, if we provoke retaliation from Putin, this just doesn't look like a credible response. It looks disproportionate to the rest of the world, especially if we were doing things like turning off the lights in Russia or or whatever. So, first point then. how this will specifically play into Putin's hands, why we make retaliation and further interference more likely from Putin. First of all, I don't think Maeve knows what sanctions actually are, because sanctions are incredibly extensive. We've already done things like ban companies from trading in dollars. We've already done things like seize assets and freeze assets of oligarchs abroad. We've already done things like find every single country or corporation who trades with corporations inside Russia. I'm just not clear what she's adding. She says, well, companies trade with each other inside Russia. Sure they do, but the Russian economy has collapsed under the weight of sanctions post-Ukraine anyway, when you can't trade with people or when you can't import goods from abroad. So specifically, how will this then play into Putin's hands if you're not doing much more economic damage? Putin bases his power upon an appeal to Russian nationalism. He's never pretended that he's going to be good economically for Russia. After the chaos of the late 90s and early 2000s, Russian people wanted order. They looked towards a tradition of strong leaders. Historically, there was a lack of democratic institutions there. Crucially then for Putin, he needs an enemy who he can portray himself against. He needs to be able to point to things like the US is interfering with us, the US is hacking us. Maeve says the reason she wouldn't want to intervene militarily is because if we kill random Russians, that might provoke a backlash. But newsflash, when you turn off power supplies and hospitals can't carry out operations because they don't have power grids anymore, or where trains crash because signals have failed, that is killing random Russians. Russians will see this correctly as it is, an unjustified piece of US aggression. They believe the line that it is Trump's fault that hacking occurred, that it wasn't Russian aggression. It makes it more likely that Russians will support Putin. Crucially then, Putin has to respond in some sort of way. We see this after the occupation of Crimea. The US responds by dumping every sanction we have. He immediately has to respond back by invading eastern Ukraine. And crucially, this then crippled us in terms of being able to escalate further. We could do effectively nothing when he went to war in Syria, including bombing a number of US allied groups there, because we'd already used all of our sanctions and we weren't able to escalate up to the point of military. What we need to do to deal with Putin is to de-escalate, deny him the fact of an enemy, deny him the fact of US aggression, and at that point, like a sort of failing Russian economy or internal challenges over corruption are able to take their toll. I think that's going to be more successful than carrying out an aggressive attack. So given that we can't reverse the results of the midterm election, this doesn't deter future hacking or protect us from future hacking, and it makes other forms of Russian aggression more likely in a way that we can't then escalate beyond. I think the proposition should probably fall on that basis alone. Two additional points then. One, why does this make other sort of aggression from Putin more likely going forward? Look, every time Putin is going to do something aggressively to sort of like take territory in Crimea or to back an ally in Syria, he has to trade off the costs and benefits. The benefits internally to his popularity of standing up for Russia and looking like a strong leader versus the additional costs of additional US response. The problem with essentially blowing our load off such a weak and already ineffective attack is it means we're not able to escalate further when things get more serious. Maeve's already conceded we can never attack Russia militarily and we can never interfere with them that way. So they start doing things like undermining US sanctions on Iran, if they start doing things like providing arms to groups that might hurt other US allies in the Middle East, such as Israel or Saudi Arabia, and there's very little ways we can then respond. Like sanctions and hacking aren't just like words to be thrown around. These have serious consequences. These require major commitment, major time, major dollars from the US to invest into this. We need to save these for the most serious cases rather than just essentially gamble that this will be the straw that finally breaks Putin's back and throws him down. Lastly then, the effect this has on the US image abroad. I mean, this just looks like an aggressive and disproportionate response. It hurts a number of our allies. Like Maeve says, well, we want to hack Russian power grids like Gazprom. Gazprom also supplies electricity to about 200 million people across the European Union. I don't think these people are going to be terribly pleased if we crash the grid and also take out their powers. Crucially, the US needs to keep the EU on board in order to maintain sanctions. Like sanctions against Iran are going to fail because the EU has broken from Trump's line on Iran and isn't going to shore up European sanctions. In order for even our current measures against Russia to work, we need to not be alienating our allies. And you do alienate your allies when this looks like an aggressive move. Everyone in Europe blames Trump for the election. We don't sort of blame Vladimir Putin's interference. And this just looks like an aggressive, disproportionate move. This additionally impacts how other countries are likely to view the US here. Because with Trump in office, there's already the danger that the US looks like a mad dog, that it no longer has any serious clout in world leadership. When it's doing things like attacking Russia in this way, when it is killing innocent Russian civilians, when it takes out their power and transport grids, this makes the US look more aggressive, and it makes it less likely that countries will take the US line on this. You lose the moral high ground. You lose the ability to lead allies to compel them to support US interests either in the Middle East or against Russia. This is an ineffective and tokenistic measure designed to appease an irrational panic. It distracts from actual solutions, ruins the US image abroad, and serves only to make future Russian interference more likely. You should oppose.
Thank you, Owen. So now we will have a cross-examination.
Perfect.
3 minutes.
Great, thank you. I'll just put on my timer 1 second. Okay. I wanted you to actually listen to my speech because I didn't really advocate turning off the power grids to kill ordinary Russians. I said turn off the lights within the companies and their offices so they can't send emails to each other. I don't think that's going to be killing Europeans or killing Russians in the same way that you're advocating.
Okay. I just don't think Russian oligarchs care enough about the inconvenience of losing email for a couple of hours to launch a violent revolution against Putin. But also, hacking doesn't work like that, where you can just literally take out the exact email server. If you're doing things like trying to DDoS an entire company's network or whatever just by overloading it with information, you don't control what the response does. This isn't where numbers flash across the screen, you go, I'm in, and then you've taken control over all of their computers. It's a much cruder measure than that, and we just don't have the ability to finesse it in the way that you're asserting we do.
Okay, you say that we should de-escalate. I mean, didn't Obama try and reset with that big red button, and Clinton? I mean, has de-escalation ever worked with Russia?
But he didn't de-escalate, right? As soon as Putin went into Crimea, we imposed every single sanction we had. We had no point did we de-escalate after that when they then invaded Donbass or then bombed Syria against the wishes of our allies. I'm not necessarily advocating that we strip away all sanctions for everything, but I just think escalating further is unlikely to work in this case.
You've slightly missed the point. I asked if we tried to de-escalate and then Russia escalated by invading Crimea, did our de-escalation policies work, or did they still roll all over us anyway?
No. I'm contesting we didn't try to de-escalate prior to that.
Okay, fair enough. Look, you say that we should do this another time and save this policy for when things get more serious. I think undermining our democracy and putting a man who is implicated in 2 federal crimes related to the Russian investigation is about as serious as it gets.
Yeah, but you've missed the point. It wasn't the Russian interference that was determinative in the election. Trump was likely to win it anyway. If you're looking for the smoking gun, it's James Comey and the FBI rather than random Russians. There's a whole load of much more serious things that Putin does all the time. He does things like slaughter innocent people in Syria and approve the use of chemical weapons. These are much more serious things that we should care about more, rather than some cyber attacks, which the US can do a lot to defend itself from anyway.
I mean, I slightly think that you've missed the point, because I'm saying that the Mueller investigation has actually showed that they purged voter rolls, right? Or that they tried to misturn out the minority vote in certain areas. You're just characterizing it as memes because that's how Trump is selling it. But if you actually read the report and the indictments that he's criminally put forward, you also say that the Mueller investigation hasn't ended yet. The criminal part about Russia has. It's the Trump part that's not finished.
Yeah, but we can't rerun the 2016 presidential election, right? We can just take voter rolls offline where they can't be hacked. Just put them on closed-circuit computers. This isn't a difficult thing to do to protect against it.
Amazing. So we can't rerun the 2016 election, but I think that what I'm trying to say is that the attempt was egregious enough and that it worked in significant ways because those voters were purged, right? And that we do need to respond because of that.
Yeah, but that's only true if the response brings the outcome you're looking for. If it makes things worse, shores up Putin's position, or makes other forms of aggression more likely, then we shouldn't just randomly respond for the sake of it.
I mean, I honestly think that we randomly... Oh, no, we're out of time for the speeches, sorry. Okay.
All right, we have reached the summary portion of our debate today, part 3. So now we will hear a summary statement from both Maeve and from Owen, and Maeve will be going first in favor.
Perfect.
How long?
4 minutes, I think.
4 minutes.
Okay. I'm going to summarise by really attacking the arguments that we just heard from Owen, and a little bit in the crossfire too, which got a bit heated, but we're good friends, don't worry. Right. So Owen says, well, the Russian hacking wasn't that successful anyway, and even if it was, there's nothing we can do about it. I mean, I've tried to prove to you guys that it was incredibly successful because like the margins where Trump won in certain districts was very, very small. So even if it was like small amount of voter rolls that were purged or small amount of minority votes that were oppressed, that has a massive cumulative like aggregate effect, right, on democracy as a whole, right? So there was a huge effect, first of all. Second of all, even if there wasn't, do you know what? Even if they just tried to send memes, I think that is an egregious violation of US democracy. It is an egregious violation of our sphere, of our country, and an attack on our country, right? Attacking our democracy is equivalent, in a sense, of going to war with us, or trying to undermine our democratic institutions. Like, hilariously, Owen says, all we need to do instead is to, like, shore up our democratic institutions, because that's why people didn't vote. Like, I mean, the reason a lot of people don't trust their democratic institutions is because the Russians systemically undermined them and leaked misinformation about the FBI or leaked misinformation about what the CIA does. Like, deliberately made people feel distrustful so that they wouldn't come out to vote. So, like, the laughable efforts to say that we can just fix these things post hoc without actually addressing the problem in the first instance is, in a sense, laughable, right? So then Owen says, well, we shouldn't do this because the Mueller investigation isn't over. I mean, first of all, read the news. The actual criminal indictment part has happened, and we know that the Russians did this, right? And we know exactly what they've done and who has done it. But second of all, it misses like the whole core premise of my speech is that the midterms are happening in 30 days. That's why we have to do this right now. If we want to protect the midterms and we want to make sure that the Democrats actually have a fair chance at taking the Senate, they will never take the Senate if like voters are purged again, right? Or if voter booths just don't work. Owen says, well, do you know what we can do? We can just have better voting machines. I mean, good luck doing that in the next 30 days, right? So like we have to do it now, and we have to do it to protect the presidential election in 2020. Owen says, well, look, people will just continue to hack us in the future. I mean, the best way to defend yourself against attack isn't just to like build better voting systems. It's also to stop yourself from being attacked, right? At the point where we stop Russia attacking us, it's a pretty good way of self-defense, right? So look, he says, how is this different from sanctions? And then lists a load of things that are external. So he says, well, we really stop them having dollars or assets in other countries or like external vying. I mean, that's exactly my point. The internal economy of Russia is huge, and it always has been, because that's how the USSR traded, because we weren't trading with them when they were the USSR either, right? The internal economy is the economy of Russia that matters, and especially matters post the Magnitsky sanctions. They've had to trade with each other internally, right? So like crippling that will work. He says that like the cronies around Putin won't do enough to do a coup. Maybe that's true, but Putin will be afraid enough that they will, that he's going to back down. And it's that fear that Putin has that makes him realise that hacking in the midterms in 2018 or hacking the presidential campaign in 2020 isn't worth the risk. What we're doing is raising the costs for him of this action. He looks at the action, he says, if I tell my voters or if I tell the people in Russia that this is happening, they will say, why aren't you doing a stronger response, right? Like, why aren't our light grids are being turned off in certain companies, or our companies aren't effective anymore, right? Or their supply chains are somewhat disrupted, right? Why aren't we responding? He knows he can't escalate either without killing ordinary Russians, which won't go down very popular, right? So he can't tell them that this is happening because he knows he has no effective response. The only effective response for him is, as I said, is not to do it. It's the only winning move for Putin is not to play, is not to interfere in our elections. And we make that crystal clear to him, right? Like, notably, the first thing I said in my speech is Owen has to prove how he protects the midterms in 2018, how he protects the presidential campaign in 2020. We heard no alternatives and no reason why he can. I think that that proposition should win this debate. You're here from Maeve.
Thank you for your summary, Maeve. Now we'll hear from Owen with your 4-minute summary.
There are lots of things other than this that the US can do to either protect itself from the midterms. Well, probably not the midterms, because they're in 30 days. I don't think either side of the House makes any difference. But future elections, sure. There are more important things. There are the innocent lives we could still save in countries like Syria or wherever the next conflict zone is in the Middle East if we don't alienate our allies and still have measures to escalate against Russia and deter them from doing future things. I think those things are more important than forcing the US to spend a bit more money on cyber security, which would be our other response. Look, I just don't care about the principle of retaliating for the sake of it. Sure, the 2016 election was bad. We can't undo that. It's like if someone comes around and punches you, sure, we could toss a grenade at their house, but that won't leave you unpunched, and it will probably make the the whole situation just worse. There is one relevant question for you to judge in this debate, and it is, will this prevent future harm to the world? Will this prevent future harm in these elections? So there's 3 blankets under this. Number 1, what will Putin's response be? Putin has to respond to this if we escalate and sort of hack Russia internally in this way. Why? Because Ivan and Ivana are having exactly the same debate in Russia as soon as we do this, as to whether they should then further respond to US aggression with cyber hacking. Maeve's already told us he can't bomb America, he can't do anything to meaningfully sanction America, so all he can do is double down on efforts to interfere further in our elections in the hope that he gets his own man in the White House. You make that more likely on your side of the House. Secondly, then, the mechanism she relies upon is that this will finally be the straw that brings down Putin, the dictator who successfully ruled Russia for something like 14 years, and this will be what brings him down. Both the mechanisms she suggests for this are extremely unlikely. The first is that oligarchs will launch a palace coup over this. Now, I mean, we've already put a lot of pressure on these oligarchs. Like, most of them can't go outside Russia without having all their stuff seized. We've taken all their fancy houses in London and all their bank accounts in Harrods and stuff like that. So the additional harm that we're doing to them won't make much of a difference. Maeve's tried to both have her cake and eat it, right? She's tried to claim the impact of this hacking will be huge enough that it will massively hurt oligarchs' profits and force them to overthrow Putin. But it will also be small enough that it won't actually harm any Russian people. There's no, obviously both of these things can't be true. If their profits are being harmed, then that's putting Russian workers out of business. If we're hurting their supply networks, that's meaning Russian people can't get hold of food. Precisely the problem she was concerned about is one that happens. Like, I just don't think her mechanism that Putin will be afraid enough that a coup might happen, therefore he'll stop attacking America works. Like, he has so much power over these oligarchs. He puts them in jail for corruption all the time whenever they displease him at all. I just don't think this is ever likely to happen. I don't think it's ever going to be in these people's interest to overthrow Putin. Because even if this does hurt them a little bit, they still know that they're much, much better off as corrupt oligarchs in Russia now than they would be if Russia were actually free and democratic, where people might have some sort of check on their power. So the only other mechanism she's then relying upon for bringing down Putin is that there will be some sort of popular revolt, or the Russian people as a whole will throw him out. I mean, she's shrugging because she knows exactly how ridiculous it is, right? When they know that the harms that they're suffering, that their loss of electricity, that their loss of food, that the train crashes that suspiciously start happening more, are as a result of American interference, they're not going to back down. In the same way that a little bit of Russian hacking hasn't caused all of you guys to go, oh no, we must surrender to Russia right now. Obviously, the response will be the opposite. They'll back the strongest, most aggressive, most pro-Russian leader they have, and that's Putin. There is no one in Russia who will do a better job of standing up for their interests. So look, if you genuinely believe that this slight measure, this a little bit more hacking, is what's going to bring down Putin's government or suddenly stop him from being aggressive to the US and make him change every piece of policy he's pursued for his entire life, by all means vote for Prop. But if you don't believe that's the case, then no good comes of this. Additional harms come from escalation. And all the stuff I've talked about in terms of losing allies, in terms of losing the ability to escalate further in more important situations are true. I think that is more credible. I think you should vote for side opposition.
All right, everybody cooled off? All right, thank you, debaters. That was fantastic. Now it is time to take a vote. Who made the better argument? You will decide. How many favor the proposition this House believes the United States should retaliate against ongoing Russian interference in U.S. elections? How many people oppose? I'm going to stand behind Maeve. I'm going to put my hand here, and it's going to be by a round of applause who wins. All right?
Okay.
We'll start here.
This is very scary. Thanks, Melinda.
Okay, sounds good. Owen?
They were just clapping louder.
Could you tell? No. We'll do this again, and I really need you to raise the roof. Okay?
we could do hands.
This is so stressful.
Okay, the meter is moving. The meter is moving, Owen. All right. What did you say? Sounds like Owen is our winner
By
of
a
today's
margin.
debate.
Congratulations.
We will now take a break. Ladies and gentlemen, please give both debaters a round of applause.